So to take this alpha and now turn it into real geometry, first I want to reset my scene here inside of ZBrush. So I'm coming up here to Document, and I'm just going to go to New Document, and this is going to give me a new canvas on my screen here. Now we're going to use the surface noise modifier to actually turn the alpha we generated into real geometry. So to do this, I'm going to come over to the tool palette over here. I'm just going to click on my tool, and I'm going to first select the plane 3D object. With that plane 3D object selected, I'm going to return to the center of my canvas and simply click and drag. This is going to drag that plane 3D object out on the screen here. After it's about this size, we're going to come over here and turn on Edit or press T on our keyboard. And now we should be able to move around the actual plane 3D object here. I'm next going to come over here and turn on polyframes and also activate the floor grid. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. So right now, by default, the plane 3D object comes in facing in this direction, or the front of the actual camera. So I need to kind of rotate this so it's actually sitting on the ground plane, so I can start applying that alpha for the city and then have it actually grow off of that surface. So underneath the tool palette here, I'm going to come down to the Initialize tab, and I'm going to change my alignment from Z to align Y, and that should now change the position of that actual plane 3D object. Now it's generating on the actual floor of our grid here. So now with this positioned correctly, I'm just going to come up here and click Make Polymesh 3D, which is going to turn it into a Polymesh 3D object. I'm going to deactivate floor and then also turn off polyframes. So now that I have this plane set up, I'm going to go underneath the tool menu again and open up the surface palette. And in here I'm going to activate noise. When you click noise, it's actually going to open up the noise maker right here. And if you rotate in your scene, you should have that plane 3D object, which should now look like this. Now with this visible here, I'm going to make sure it's actually positioned so it's fully facing the camera like so. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click on alpha on off, and I'm going to load in that alpha that we created originally and saved out. So just come over here and click. And now I'm just going to select that building image that we export out and just hit open. Now this should be loaded in right here. So now I want to change some of these options over here. The first thing I want to do is I want to come down here to this FH button, or flip horizontally, and I'm just going to click that. Then I want to turn the mix basic noise all the way to 0, and I want to turn the strength all the way up. So after you have that process kind of done, you should end up with something like this in your actual window here, where you have this alpha that we created being applied to that actual plane 3D object. Now with this being applied, I'm just going to hit OK. And now you're going to see your actual plane 3D object here on the screen with that kind of noise being applied to the surface. Now this noise that we put on here is just being applied in preview mode. So if you kind of rotate your plane here, you're going to see as you get to kind of this angle, you're not going to see the actual noise applied to that surface there. But if we come over here and simply just click BPR, ZBrush is going to look at that surface noise and then render it with BPR to create actual geometry. So you can see now these buildings actually have height information being applied to them, and it's actually displacing these buildings from that plane 3D object. So you can see now we have this kind of cityscape generated from that actual alpha we created. Right now this is only visible here in BPR, so if I rotate the model, you're going to see it's actually going to turn off, and then I'll have to just position it again and then hit BPR, and I'll get the effect. Now I want to actually convert this to real geometry. So to do that, it's actually very simple as well. I'm just going to come over here under the tool palette and go to the geometry tab, and I'm just going to click this convert BPR to geo. So this is going to take that BPR effect we're seeing on the screen here, and it's going to turn what we see into actual geometry. I'm just going to come over here and click that, and it's going to process, and now this has processed the model here with that BPR render, and it has now converted it to actual geometry. So now when I rotate around, you're seeing that the effect is actually holding because this is actually geometry here on my canvas. So it's really fast process to take what you see in BPR and just with one click turn it into actual geometry. Now the city right now is a little bit short. Some of these buildings need to be a little bit taller. So I'm going to turn off perspective. I'm going to come to the side like this. Then I'm going to navigate up here to the top to this Move button, or press W on my keyboard, and activate the Move Transpose line. Now with the Move Transpose line selected, I'm just going to hover to a lower part of the city here, around ground level. I'm just going to click and then drag up in a vertical fashion. And while I'm dragging up, I'm going to hold Shift, and that's going to lock this transposed line into this kind of vertical aspect, like so. Now after I get this kind of positioned about right here, I'm now going to come to this actual center circle on the actual top here and make sure I have that highlighted and click and drag vertically and then hold shift as well. And this is going to allow me to increase the height of these actual buildings here. So you can see I'm actually growing them a little bit taller. Now after you have them at a height you kind of like, I'm just going to release. And I'm going to go back into draw mode, just coming over here and clicking. And now if I rotate the model around, you can see now these actual skyscrapers in my scene here are a little bit taller than they were originally. So now I have the city as real geometry, and I have the height of the buildings where I want them to be. I'm going to manipulate this geometry here a little bit more. I'm actually going to trim off the areas on the mesh that were outside of the actual alpha space. So since I created this alpha in kind of a rectangular format, I have some areas on the model that are generating clipped buildings. So you can see like the areas up here, I have some of these buildings that are kind of split in half, so we don't really want that. And same with this part down here. So the first thing I'm going to look at is where this actual horizontal image fell on the actual plane 3D object here. So if I look right through this area, you can see this is my actual divide here. So I'm going to come through and separate this top chunk off and then also separate the bottom chunk off. So I'm only left with this part in the middle. So to do this, I'm going to hold Control and Shift, and by default you get the Select Rectangle brush that will appear up here. And I'm going to come over here and change this by simply clicking, and I'm going to change this to the actual Slice Curve brush. Now after this is selected, the actual Slice Curve brush is now going to be my default brush when I hold Control and Shift, and you should see it active up here. Now with this brush selected, if I come across my model and simply hold Control and Shift and then drag, I'm going to get a slice line. Now when you draw this out, if you have Shift still held, you can actually draw it out and have it snap to a specific angle. So I wanted to snap directly horizontally, so I'm just going to hold Shift. And then you can also press spacebar, which will allow you to move it around like so. So I want to slice right through this area here where these buildings are meeting, right at the top here. So I'm going to make sure this is kind of positioned right where I want it, and then holding spacebar kind of move it a little bit more to line it up exactly, and then I'm just going to release. Now if I turn my polyframes on quickly and then deactivate the actual line option by just clicking the word line up here, you'll see that that slice is now sliced through this area on my model here, and I have a different polygroup on top than I do on the bottom. So this is going to allow me to come through next and hide this area of geometry on my actual model. So now that I have the top area kind of split or sliced, I'm going to come and actually do it down to this bottom area as well. So holding Control and Shift, and dragging out with the slice brush, and then I'm just going to reposition it like so, holding spacebar, and then when I have it where I want it, I'm just going to release, and it should slice through the geometry like that. So now I have 3 polygroups on this actual model here. Well, I only want this middle section, I want to remove this top and bottom section. So I'm going to hold Control and Shift again, and I'm going to change my selection brush back to the actual select rectangle, like so. And now I'm returning to my canvas, I'm going to hold Control and Shift, and I'm just going to click this middle polygrouped area. Now when you click it, you'll notice that it's just isolated this one polygroup, and the other polygroups have now been hidden. So now I can rotate the model around, and now you can see I have all those kind of clipped buildings removed from my actual city here. So I'm going to turn off polyframes to kind of see that a little bit better. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to delete those hidden sections that we just hid. So I'm going to come over here to the actual tool palette again, go underneath the geometry tab and open up the modify topology area, and then just click delete hidden. Now when you click delete hidden, it's going to remove those hidden areas of a model and just leave you with this as the actual geometry. So now we have our cityscape like so. Now the entire process to get to this stage here was extremely fast. So we just generated a few buildings using the ZModeler brush. We then took those buildings and generated an alpha using the 2.5D canvas. And then we just took that alpha and applied it to a plane 3D object using surface noise to get a cityscape generated. Now, since the process of applying the actual city to the plane 3D object was using surface noise, you can also modify your alphas. So say I generated that alpha with 2.5D and I wanted to create a larger city, I could modify that alpha just to make the city larger, and then do that same process of applying it to the plane 3D object, and I could have a larger city created extremely fast. Now, if you're at this stage already, we can also still expand our city if needed by simply just duplicating the subtools. So if I come back over here to the tool palette, I can open up the subtool menu here, and then I can just duplicate this actual tool by coming down here and just clicking on duplicate. Now after this has been duplicated, I can now select the new version and kind of rotate to a top position like so, and maybe turn off perspective. And I come up here now and select the actual move transpose line. And instead of actually drawing this out and then moving, if I simply just hover over any part of the model with move transpose selected and simply hold Alt and then click and drag, I'll be able to perform a screen space move on my model here. And so this will allow me to come through and start duplicating these actual tools here. So I just can duplicate this guy again, hold down Alt, and then just simply click and drag. And I can actually start moving these duplicated versions of my model here to generate a more elaborate or expansive city. So really fast process to come through and start generating cityscapes here inside of ZBrush. So now this is completed, I'm actually going to now send one of these models here to KeyShot to start generating some renders for Andrew. So I'm just going to come over here and just delete these duplicated versions. I'm just going to send one chunk in this actual tutorial. So it's going to come over here and click delete, and then just hit OK to the dialog. And now I'm just left back with that one single section of the actual city there. So now we can proceed to send this model over to KeyShot to generate some renders for Andrew using the ZBrush to KeyShot bridge.